When I started my undergrad at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, like many of my peers, I wanted to fit in. By the end of my first year, I'd found belonging in two places. The first was playing Cards Against Humanity with my friends in the library basement, which if you go here, you'll know that the basements are usually the only spaces where you can breathe without getting like a death stare. And the second spot was in my independent, student-run newspaper called The Medium. As a first-year student, as I navigated the very confusing hallways of this institution, I kept noticing newspaper stands stacked at the end of each one. But I brushed off The Medium as outdated. I could think of my parents and my grandparents as they read their morning paper with their coffee. But for me, all I needed was my phone. Well, one day, it was about 2 weeks into my first year, and I'd realized that my chemistry major was just a little bit too overwhelming and that I needed a creative outlet. My phone had died, which I am sure is a very familiar experience for anyone with an iPhone. And so I knew that I needed something to keep me engaged as I took the bus home, because if I didn't, I would probably end up across the border. So I grabbed a copy of the newspaper, I put it in my bag, and I ran out to catch the bus. I was convinced that was all it took. And that same night, I emailed the editor-in-chief at the time, and now my good friend and mentor, Ali Taha, outlining my interest to join the Medium. Because within 12 pages of newsprint, I'd found a community that I truly resonated with. I wasn't going to share this email with you today because it's quite embarrassing, and I don't talk like that anymore or email like that anymore. But I have this New Year's resolution going where I realized that embarrassment is a choice. I don't know if anybody's ever told themselves that after a faceplant. And so I'm going to share a little part of it with you today. So I wrote, "Dear Ali, I'm studying life sciences, a program that is very academic rather than creative, and undoubtedly scientific. My interest in the Medium comes forth as a way for me to express my creative genome. Spoken like a real first-year go-getter science student, but I promise I do not email anybody like that anymore." But this email worked, and the next week I was writing an article about how music had shaped who I was. As a contributor, I wrote articles on professors, and I got to interview them and learn a little bit more about their research. I wrote op-eds on topics that affected me, like the importance of prioritizing mental health as a university student and how music and art had truly shaped who I was. I shared my experiences and the experiences of others. I've now served as the editor-in-chief of The Medium for the publication's 48th and 49th volumes. As I complete my last few months of undergrad, which is crazy to say, I can truly express that The Medium has shaped what I believe to be the two most important parts of undergrad, or really any stream of study. That's finding your identity and finding your voice. But this story is not exclusive to me. I'm just one thread in the interconnected realm of student journalism. I'm a piece of a larger puzzle that extends well beyond the walls of this campus and that maintains the importance of the written word. And so today, I'm here to talk to you about the power of student journalism. The institutions in which we obtain our degrees, our diplomas, and our certificates prepare us for the next phases of our lives. Within four walls of bad dining halls and really long lines to Starbucks, we'll fall in and out of love, we'll pass or sometimes barely pass our classes, and we'll constantly be asked the very dreaded question of what are you going to do after you graduate? Hated that question until I figured it out, then it was okay. But the thing is, in the first years of study, that question is so difficult to answer when academic validation is placed before personal satisfaction. And I'll give you two examples where I felt that that was the case. Both happened in my first year, which I feel like kind of sucks because it's like you're welcome into the university space. But in my first year chemistry class of 500 people, asking a question took a great act of courage. For me, what that looked like was I would write the question down, I would mumble it to myself, and then I would sometimes have the courage to raise my hand. At which point, between all those steps, the professor was like 4 slides ahead, and my neighbors were looking at me like, "Why are you talking to yourself, girl?" Well, another example, also in my first year, in my bio class, I was given a writing assignment. And myself and all of my peers had the same writing prompt, the same word count, the same rubric, and the same instructions. So how can you really feel like you have your own voice in this kind of environment? Well, what if I told you there exists a space where your voice is not overlooked? This is student journalism. But before I continue, I'd like to emphasize that student journalism is not just for aspiring journalists. I'm not an aspiring journalist. I believe that student journalism is a practice of what many philosophers call the freedom of assembly, which is the belief that humans can gather in public or in private and together as a collective advocate for change. It allows students and community members to define who they are beyond their degrees. My generation is complex. We think like we never have before, and we're experiencing a lot of stigma, mental health struggles, racial and gender discrimination. The list goes on. Two things that have affected me personally. The first one is called academic inflation, which is pretty much the belief that employers are now looking for masters and PhDs as they seek their employees. It's the truth. A lot of employers are looking for a little bit higher education than what we're getting in 4 years. Another example is, which I'm sure everyone here, if you live in the GTA, you're familiar with this, called home price inflation. Have you heard of her? Well, she makes me feel like I might just be living at home for God knows how long, and perhaps I'll switch out my Lana Del Rey posters from middle school for something more aesthetic I find at Winners, because, it's time to outgrow that phase. Well, these are the kinds of topics that we've recently covered in the Medium's print issues. We print once a week on paper, and so we're in constant conversation with our community, reminding them that we are listening. There's our individual voice, as I mentioned, but this is our collective voice, and it's the one that reminds us that we are not alone. Words connect us. When an international student writes about their bouts of homesickness, another international student that's been curled up in the residence accommodation so far from home feels a little bit less alone. When a student writer shares that they've had to drop a class because the workload was just too much, another student feels a little bit less alone. And when a third writer shares that they are still trying to explore and understand who they are and their identity, another student, or really all of us, feel a little bit less alone. Words fuel more than just fictional storytelling. Words fuel movement, they fuel change, and they fuel individuals and communities to stand strong. In the academic space, it is so easy for these kinds of conversations to be silenced. But the truth is, they bear the most importance to the health and well-being of university students. In such a big space with thousands of kids and hundreds of halls, it's so easy to feel alone. So we must talk to hear an echo. The Medium's editorial board, my lovely team, meets each Sunday, and our section editors present pitches or article topics for the subsequent issues. We understand that it might be difficult for students to approach us with their opinion, so we approach them. We have themed issues that cover topics like Black History Month, Happy Black History Month, mental health awareness, LGBTQ awareness, cultural appreciation, and so on. These are the kinds of voices that are omnipresent and yet marginalized in our communities. Well, another great thing for all of those folks that love LinkedIn, student journalism is also a great way to build real-life skills. Because truth is, I think we've forgotten as a society that as we've adopted social media and 280-character tweets and emojis and text messages, that just like in singing, in acting, or in dancing, we all have such unique voices in writing. English is not my first language. It's actually my fourth. And so after spending the entirety of my last year of high school SparkNotes translating Shakespeare's Hamlet, because what's going on there, I carried a lot of fear and a lot of discomfort starting to write for the Medium. But it took my first article to understand that student journalism is an educative, not like in the boring way, and very fun space where no matter your English language proficiency, your Shakespeare language proficiency, your background, or where you're from, or how much you've written, or how little you've written, or what you're studying, you'll be welcomed and you will be supported. We have a team of copy editors, who I'm grateful for helping me put this all together, who know where to place the commas, who know how to address syntax and structure, and who know how to make your argument with your name on it sound compelling. It's a team effort, and it's really a great learning opportunity. Despite all that, though, as adults, we fear making mistakes. And that's because there is tremendous shame that surrounds making even the smallest of mistakes. I'm sure everyone here has sent an email before you finish typing it, and then your reply to that email is longer, like the apology, because you're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. That's the kind of mistakes that we as a society have deemed to be the end of it all. Well, as a student journalist, I've made many mistakes. And so far, thankfully, there's been no jail time, which, trust me, is a real thing. Well, one of the first articles that I ever wrote as a student journalist was an interview with my first-year chemistry professor, Judith Poey. I titled the article "The Legendary Professor Judith Poey" because she really is a legend and she deserves this shout-out. Well, in the initial print of that article, I mistakenly wrote that Professor Poey is an ardent supporter of the Chicago Bears, an American professional basketball team. Whoa, I messed up. And to be honest, when I realized that I messed up, I was ready to change my name, move to Guatemala, and take on a whole new identity. Because I really thought that that was the end of my career. That was going to be the last article that I ever wrote. It was over, drop out, you're done. But it wasn't. It was just one mistake that taught me 3 lessons. And each mistake since have also taught me a lot of lessons, but if I go into those, we'll be here forever. The first lesson was to fact check. I'm glad I learned it 2 articles in and not, 4 years later. The second lesson was to watch more sports, and I will admit I'm still working on that. It's not going very well. And the third lesson was kind of funny. It was to come on class on time, because turns out Professor Poey used to quiz the class on the team's scores from the night before during the first 10 minutes of class, which for me was usually the time that I spent looking for parking. So there you go, 3 really great lessons. The medium began 53 years ago, only 1 year after the start of Arundel College, which is now known as the University of Toronto, Mississauga. The paper was founded by Robert Rudolph and Doug Leese, who said that it all started on a shoestring budget upstairs at Coleman House. Nobody was doing what we were doing. We were cutting our own trail. In the first issue of the Arundelian, Rudolph and Leese outlined what the purpose of the paper was. It was to share the opinions of the students and to keep the administration in check. Well, just below that very inspiring mandate was a slightly more intimidating message that read, "We need help, anybody to do anything." We were desperate, but it's worked out because here I am in front of you today. In 1974, we would cover a murder in the neighboring park to our campus. And in 1991, a body was found in that same park. Now, I share this with you today because a part of what I do is look through the archive and educate myself on everyone that's come before me and get inspired and understand the legacies that have come before. And as I read this, I realized that I used to walk through that same park every day to get to my car. And so I stopped because that was just a terrifying thought. But these are the kinds of things that we've documented in our communities. Later, we would cover the ban of ball hockey on campus and a student that was handcuffed when dealing with suicidal ideation in our health center. These were the kinds of stories that previous editors like myself had broken to the community. I'd go on to break my own stories, soon realizing that myself and the 53 previous editors-in-chief had all had a fair share of imposter syndrome, had all spent a very long time thinking about legacy, and had all gotten angry emails from readers and writers. It's part of the gig. But we'd all emerged victorious, and not because we didn't cry a little or a lot, let loose a little, or stay way past our bedtime in the medium's office, I'm sorry, Mom, but because we had made sure that all voices were heard loud and clear. With a greater understanding of student journalism, I would say that student journalism today serves to entertain, inform, educate, and challenge existing hierarchies. We break through the silence and we keep the administration honest, and we serve as the medium, pun intended, of record for our campus. Previous editor-in-chief, Bruce Dobigan, a now renowned author and journalist, Advise student journalists to run with it, have fun with it, and understand that free speech is hearing people that you don't necessarily agree with. That's the most important thing. I would say that student journalism today is adapting and it's evolving. In an effort to be captivating and to be, interesting to more audiences, we've started publishing our content online, exploring platforms like podcasts and video content and magazines and social media. Not only my generation, but my generation of student journalists will too adapt to the terrifying effects of new media and AI with a lot of ease. Earlier in my talk, I mentioned that in my first encounter with a newspaper stand, I brushed it off as outdated. That's a challenge for student journalism. A lot of us are adapting and moving everything online as fast as we can, but others, like myself, are desperately hanging on to that paper trail. Call it nostalgia, or call it something for mom to put on the fridge. I promise you that a paper copy of a student paper is the looking glass into the future and the mirror of the past. And so on your visit to a university or college campus, or if you're brave enough on your way out of here today, I urge you to pick up a copy of a student newspaper and get a taste of what's to come. The mountain that I'm standing on is the legacy of all the previous writers and editors of student publications. I've realized that each student and each community member has a legacy of their own. We may not have heard them all just yet, but I promise you that student journalism will welcome each one with open arms. Thank you.